The Tax Exile Years, How Paul Hogan Became Australia's Most Wanted. In the annals of celebrity persecution and government overreach, few stories are as shocking as Paul Hogan's transformation from beloved national treasure to hunted fugitive. As Australia's most successful cultural ambassador became the target of the most vindictive and politically motivated tax investigation in the nation's history, forcing him into a decade-long exile that would destroy his health, his relationships, and his faith in the country he had served so faithfully. This is the explosive exposé of how the Australian Taxation Office, driven by political pressure and bureaucratic jealousy, turned Paul Hogan into Australia's most wanted man through 8 years of relentless harassment that violated every principle of justice, fairness, and constitutional protection, while teaching the entire nation that extraordinary success would be punished rather than celebrated by the very institutions supposed to protect productive citizens. The transformation from cultural icon to tax exile represents one of the most shameful chapters in Australian legal history, as government agencies used unlimited taxpayer resources to pursue a man whose only crime was achieving international recognition that made politicians and bureaucrats feel inadequate by comparison. The departure prohibition, asset freezes, and media persecution that characterized Paul's tax exile years revealed the true nature of Australian tall poppy syndrome disguised as law enforcement. Most devastatingly, Paul's exile was not the result of any criminal behavior or legitimate tax evasion, but the consequence of complex international business structures being reinterpreted years after the fact by government officials seeking high-profile prosecutions to advance their own careers while destroying the life of someone whose cultural contributions had generated billions in economic benefits for the country now hunting him. This is the definitive account of how Paul Hogan's tax exile years proved that in modern Australia, success makes you a target, achievement makes you an enemy, and international recognition makes you a fugitive from the very homeland whose reputation you enhanced through decades of authentic cultural ambassadorship that served national interests better than any formal diplomatic program. Chapter 1. The Trap is Set. The systematic destruction of Paul Hogan through tax exile began not with evidence of wrongdoing, but with a calculated decision by Australian government agencies to make an example of the country's most successful international entertainer, transforming routine business arrangements into criminal conspiracy allegations that would force him to choose between financial ruin and permanent exile from his homeland. Around 2005, news gets out that the tax department are looking into all the profit from the Crocodile Dundee movies. Is it being placed in offshore tax havens? All that sort of stuff. They start an investigation. Paul recalled about the beginning of what would become the most expensive and destructive celebrity persecution in Australian history, disguised as legitimate law enforcement but motivated by political opportunism and bureaucratic jealousy. The selection of Paul as target was not random or based on credible evidence of criminal behavior, but represented a strategic choice to pursue someone whose international prominence would generate maximum publicity for government agencies seeking to demonstrate their effectiveness in combating tax avoidance while actually serving their own political and career interests. The ATO alleges he owes millions of dollars of unpaid taxes relating to his Crocodile Dundee franchise, but these allegations were based on retroactive reinterpretations of legitimate business structures that had been professionally recommended and properly implemented under existing tax laws when the original decisions were made, demonstrating the arbitrary nature of government persecution disguised as law enforcement. The complexity of international entertainment business arrangements provided government prosecutors with opportunities to characterize routine professional practices as potential criminal behavior, particularly when those practices involved multiple jurisdictions and the kind of sophisticated planning that successful international careers require for legal compliance and financial management. It was one of my financial advisors early on. What I believe is that he was getting investigated and he offered them a bigger fish, which is what they were instructed to get, and suggested that Paul was the mastermind behind this particular scheme, revealing the betrayal that made the government's case possible, inside information provided by someone with clear motivation to trade his client's confidential business details for immunity from his own legal troubles. The trap that was set for Paul involved using his former advisor's intimate knowledge of his business arrangements to construct narratives about criminal intent and tax avoidance that could be presented to media outlets and political figures as evidence of wrongdoing, regardless of whether such interpretations could be sustained in court under proper legal scrutiny. The political timing of the investigation was not coincidental, as government agencies faced public pressure to demonstrate their effectiveness in combating high-profile tax avoidance while avoiding the political risks of pursuing actual criminal organizations or wealthy individuals with significant political connections and legal resources. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and they started investigating me. Paul admitted, but this wasn't naivety about the advisor's motivations. It was the natural consequence of trusting someone whose professional obligations required absolute confidentiality and loyalty to client interests rather than cooperation with government agencies seeking prosecution targets. The legal framework that enabled Paul's persecution included expanded government powers to interpret business structures as potentially criminal, freeze assets based on allegations rather than convictions, and impose departure prohibitions that effectively made Australian citizens prisoners in their own country without due process or constitutional protection. The media strategy that accompanied the investigation included strategic leaks of allegations and investigation details designed to generate negative publicity and public pressure that would make continued resistance to government demands economically and psychologically unsustainable, regardless of the actual evidence or legal merits of the case. The international dimensions of Paul's business arrangements created additional opportunities for government harassment through complex jurisdictional challenges, foreign asset investigations, and the kind of bureaucratic persecution that could be sustained indefinitely while consuming whatever financial resources he possessed for legal defense. The precedent that Paul's case established for future government persecution of successful Australians included the demonstration that international achievement could be recharacterized as evidence of unpatriotic tax avoidance, that complex business structures could be portrayed as criminal conspiracy, and that public success made individuals vulnerable to government agencies seeking high-profile prosecutions to justify their political relevance. The constitutional violations that characterized Paul's persecution included denial of due process, presumption of guilt rather than innocence, punishment before conviction, and the use of government resources to destroy an individual's reputation and livelihood based on allegations that were never proved in court and ultimately resolved through forced settlement rather than judicial determination. The economic impact of the investigation on Paul's life included not just direct legal costs but opportunity costs from projects he couldn't pursue while under investigation, asset freezes that prevented normal financial planning, and the reputation damage that eliminated income sources and collaborative opportunities that had sustained his career for decades. Chapter 2, The Departure Prohibition Trap. The most shocking violation of Paul Hogan's constitutional rights occurred when Australian government agencies served him with a departure prohibition during his mother's funeral, transforming his return to Australia for family obligations into an opportunity to trap him in the country where he could be subjected to maximum pressure and harassment while being prevented from pursuing international opportunities that might have provided income for his legal defense. On Friday the 17th, Paul returned to Sydney and was served with the departure prohibition the night before his mother's funeral, revealing the calculated cruelty of using his mother's death as bait to lure him back to Australia, where government officials could demonstrate their power over someone who had achieved international recognition that made them feel inadequate by comparison. The timing of the departure prohibition was not coincidental or based on legitimate flight risk assessment, but represented a deliberately humiliating demonstration of government power designed to break Paul's psychological resistance by showing that even his most sacred family obligations could be weaponized against him by agencies accountable only to political pressure. What am I gonna do? Flee? Go change my name and get plastic surgery and live in South America? Paul asked sarcastically about the departure prohibition, highlighting the absurd nature of treating a 66-year-old entertainer with deep family ties to Australia as someone who posed genuine flight risk requiring such extreme measures that violated basic constitutional protections. The legal justification for the departure prohibition was paper-thin and based on allegations rather than evidence, demonstrating how expanded government powers had eliminated traditional protections against arbitrary detention and punishment without conviction that had previously characterized democratic legal systems. The psychological impact of being trapped in Australia while facing government persecution included the realization that his own country had become a prison where agencies could harass him indefinitely while preventing escape to jurisdictions that might provide better legal protections or opportunities to rebuild his life and career. The practical consequences of the departure prohibition extended beyond travel restrictions to include elimination of international work opportunities that might have generated income to pay mounting legal fees, creating additional financial pressure that served the government's strategy of making continued resistance economically impossible regardless of legal merits. The family relationships that were damaged by the departure prohibition included not just the trauma of being trapped during his mother's funeral, but the ongoing stress on relatives who became collateral victims of government harassment designed to create maximum personal pressure on someone whose only crime was achieving too much success. The international embarrassment that the departure prohibition created for Australia included damage to the country's reputation for respecting individual rights and constitutional protections, as foreign observers recognized the arbitrary nature of persecution that violated democratic principles while targeting someone who had enhanced rather than damaged Australia's international standing. The precedent that the departure prohibition established for future government harassment included demonstration that Australian citizens could be made prisoners in their own country based on allegations rather than convictions, that family obligations could be used as traps for government persecution, and that constitutional protections meant nothing when agencies decided to target successful individuals. The media coverage of the departure prohibition largely ignored its constitutional implications while focusing on speculation about Paul's guilt or innocence, demonstrating how government persecution could be portrayed as legitimate law enforcement even when it violated basic principles of justice and due process that supposedly protected all citizens. The business relationships that were destroyed by the departure prohibition included international partnerships and opportunities that required travel and presence in foreign markets, creating additional economic damage that served government agencies' strategy of making continued resistance financially impossible through systematic destruction of income sources. The health impact of being trapped under departure prohibition included stress-related conditions that were exacerbated by the psychological pressure of being unable to escape persecution or pursue alternatives that might provide relief from government harassment that seemed designed to continue indefinitely, regardless of resolution. The legal challenge opportunities that were limited by the departure prohibition included difficulty accessing international legal expertise and resources that might have provided better defense strategies, creating additional disadvantages that served government agencies' interest in maintaining control over someone they had decided to destroy. The social isolation that resulted from the departure prohibition included damage to relationships with colleagues and friends who became reluctant to associate with someone who was being actively persecuted by government agencies, regardless of the actual evidence or merits of charges that were being used to justify the harassment. The ultimate purpose of the departure prohibition was not preventing flight, but demonstrating government power over someone whose international success had made bureaucrats and politicians feel inadequate, proving that the persecution was motivated by jealousy and political opportunism rather than legitimate law enforcement goals or constitutional principles. Chapter 3. Living as a Hunted Man. Paul Hogan's transformation into Australia's most wanted man created a nightmare existence where every aspect of his daily life became subject to government surveillance, media scrutiny, and public suspicion that turned ordinary activities into potential evidence of criminal behavior while eliminating the privacy and dignity that should be available to any citizen facing legal challenges. The practical reality of living under constant government surveillance included awareness that his communications were being monitored, his movements were being tracked, and his financial transactions were being scrutinized for evidence that could be used to support allegations that were never clearly defined but seemed to expand whenever prosecutors needed additional pressure tactics. Even my mom would say, "In fact, you're in trouble with the tax department." "Well, you must have done something." "I didn't do anything." "Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's my mother." Paul reflected about how government allegations had poisoned even his closest family relationships, demonstrating the social damage that persecution creates when agencies use media leaks to generate public suspicion. The daily routine of someone living as a hunted man included constant awareness that any mistake, any unusual activity, or any association with questionable people could be used as evidence of guilt or additional reasons for expanded government harassment that seemed designed to continue indefinitely, regardless of cooperation or compliance with investigation demands. The financial management challenges that accompanied living as Australia's most wanted included restrictions on normal banking and investment activities that might be reinterpreted as evidence of asset hiding or money laundering, creating additional stress and economic disadvantage that served government agencies' strategy of making normal life impossible. The social relationships that were damaged by Paul's status as hunted man included friends and colleagues who became reluctant to associate with someone who was being actively pursued by government agencies, creating isolation that reinforced the psychological pressure designed to break his resistance to demands for admission of guilt or acceptance of unfair settlement terms. The professional opportunities that were eliminated by his hunted status included projects and collaborations that potential answer avoided due to risks of guilt by association or government scrutiny that might extend to anyone who worked with someone being investigated for alleged tax crimes that were never clearly explained or proved. The media attention that accompanied Paul's hunted status included constant speculation about his guilt or innocence that ignored the presumption of innocence and due process protections that should have limited public discussion of ongoing investigations until legal proceedings were completed and actual evidence was presented in court. The legal strategy challenges that faced someone living as a hunted man included the difficulty of obtaining objective legal advice when most professionals were reluctant to challenge government agencies aggressively, creating additional disadvantages that served prosecutors' interests in maintaining control over investigation timelines and settlement negotiations. The international travel restrictions that characterized Paul's hunted status extended beyond the formal departure prohibition to include practical limitations based on potential diplomatic complications and the risk that foreign governments might cooperate with Australian authorities in ways that could create additional legal vulnerabilities or harassment opportunities. The family protection concerns that arose from Paul's hunted status included worry about relatives who might become targets of government harassment designed to create additional pressure for settlement or confession, demonstrating how persecution tactics extended beyond individual targets to include innocent family members. The psychological impact of living as a hunted man included constant stress from knowing that government agencies were actively seeking evidence that could be used to justify continued harassment, creating paranoia and defensive behavior that interfered with normal decision-making and relationship-building activities. The business management complications that resulted from hunted status included difficulty maintaining normal commercial relationships when every transaction might be scrutinized as potential evidence of criminal activity, creating additional economic disadvantages that compounded the direct costs of legal defense. The health consequences of living under constant government pursuit included stress-related conditions that were exacerbated by uncertainty about investigation timelines and potential outcomes, creating physical symptoms that added medical expenses to the mounting costs of defending against allegations that were never clearly defined or substantiated. The constitutional violations that characterized Paul's treatment as hunted man included denial of presumption of innocence, punishment before conviction, and the use of government resources to destroy his reputation and livelihood based on allegations rather than evidence, proving that democratic protections meant nothing when agencies decided to target successful individuals for political purposes. Chapter 4: The Media Witch Hunt. The systematic destruction of Paul Hogan's reputation through coordinated media persecution represented one of the most shameful examples of how government agencies could weaponize public opinion against individuals who had achieved too much success, using strategic leaks and inflammatory allegations to create trial by press conference that violated every principle of due process and presumption of innocence. The media strategy that accompanied the tax investigation included regular leaks of investigation details, allegations, and speculation designed to generate negative publicity that would make continued resistance to government demands economically and psychologically unsustainable, regardless of the actual evidence or legal merits of the case against Paul. I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got that attached to me. That has sort of smirched his reputation, especially in Australia, and people will just make a crack about it. Paul noted about the permanent reputation damage created by government harassment that achieved its punishment goals even without successful prosecution. The timing of media leaks was carefully coordinated to generate maximum negative impact during key moments of the investigation, creating additional pressure for settlement while demonstrating government agencies' ability to control public narrative regardless of legal proceedings or evidence that might eventually emerge in court. The language used in media coverage consistently assumed Paul's guilt rather than maintaining neutrality required by journalistic ethics and legal presumption of innocence, with headlines and articles that characterized allegations as established facts, while ignoring the distinction between investigation and conviction that should have guided responsible reporting. The international media attention that accompanied the domestic persecution included foreign coverage that portrayed Australia as a country where successful citizens could be arbitrarily persecuted by government agencies, creating diplomatic embarrassment that damaged the nation's reputation for respecting individual rights and constitutional protections. The expert commentary that appeared in media coverage was largely provided by government officials and prosecutors who had clear motivation to justify their resource expenditure and investigation tactics, while independent legal experts who might have questioned the legitimacy of persecution tactics were systematically excluded from major coverage. The family impact of media persecution included harassment of Paul's relatives, who became collateral victims of press attention designed to generate additional pressure through public embarrassment and social isolation that extended beyond the primary target to include innocent family members. Business consequences of negative media coverage included damage to Paul's commercial relationships and professional opportunities as potential partners avoided association with someone whose reputation was being systematically destroyed by government agencies through press manipulation and strategic leak campaigns. The psychological warfare aspect of media persecution included deliberate attempts to isolate Paul from support networks and public sympathy by portraying him as wealthy tax cheat who was attempting to avoid his responsibilities to ordinary Australians who paid their fair share of taxes without complaint. The fact-checking failures that characterized media coverage included acceptance of government allegations without independent verification, repetition of claims that were never substantiated, and failure to investigate the political motivations behind agencies' decisions to pursue high-profile prosecutions rather than focusing on actual criminal organizations. The editorial decision-making that shaped media coverage reflected political pressure to support government agencies rather than maintaining journalistic independence and skepticism about official narratives, demonstrating how press freedom could be compromised when agencies decided to target individuals for political purposes. The social media amplification of negative coverage included online harassment and speculation that extended government persecution into digital spaces where Paul and his family could be subjected to additional abuse and threats from people who believed media portrayals of his alleged criminal behavior. The international business impact of media persecution included damage to Australia's reputation as a safe destination for international investment and entertainment industry collaboration, as foreign observers recognized the arbitrary nature of government harassment that could target successful individuals without due process or constitutional protection. The precedent that media persecution established for future government harassment included demonstration that press coverage could be manipulated to support agency goals regardless of evidence, that public opinion could be weaponized against individuals who challenged government authority, and that media cooperation could be obtained to support political prosecutions. The constitutional violations that media persecution represented included denial of fair trial protections through prejudicial publicity, punishment before conviction through reputation destruction, and the use of government resources to manipulate public opinion in ways that interfered with legal proceedings and democratic principles of justice. The long-term damage that media witch hunt created extended beyond Paul's individual case to include erosion of press independence, public trust in government institutions, and confidence in constitutional protections that were supposed to shield citizens from arbitrary persecution by agencies accountable only to political pressure rather than legal standards. Chapter 5. The International Manhunt. As Paul Hogan's tax persecution intensified, Australian government agencies transformed their domestic harassment campaign into an international manhunt that violated diplomatic protocols, sovereign jurisdiction principles, and international law, while demonstrating the lengths to which bureaucratic jealousy and political opportunism would go to destroy someone whose success had made them feel inadequate. The international dimensions of Paul's persecution included attempts to pressure foreign governments to cooperate with Australian tax investigations that exceeded normal treaty obligations and mutual assistance agreements, creating diplomatic complications that damaged Australia's relationships with countries that might otherwise have provided sanctuary or legal protection. The asset investigation expansion that characterized the international manhunt included attempts to freeze or seize Paul's property in multiple jurisdictions based on Australian allegations that had not been proved in court, demonstrating how domestic persecution could be exported to violate individual rights in countries with different legal systems and constitutional protections. "I'm mostly living in America. I want to be over there," Paul noted about his residence choices, but his presence in the United States made him vulnerable to additional harassment through international cooperation agreements that allowed Australian agencies to extend their persecution beyond their normal jurisdictional limits. The diplomatic pressure that Australia applied to foreign governments included requests for investigation assistance that exceeded normal law enforcement cooperation and created potential international incidents when other nations questioned the legitimacy and proportionality of harassment, campaigns that seemed motivated by political rather than legal concerns. The legal complexity that international manhunt created included multiple jurisdiction challenges where Paul faced potential persecution in different countries with varying legal standards, constitutional protections, and cooperation agreements that might not provide adequate safeguards against arbitrary government action or political prosecution. The financial institutions that were pressured to cooperate with the international manhunt included banks and investment firms in multiple countries that were asked to provide information or freeze assets based on Australian allegations rather than local legal standards, creating additional harassment opportunities that extended beyond normal law enforcement scope. The media coordination that accompanied international manhunt included strategic leaks to foreign press outlets designed to generate negative publicity in countries where Paul might seek sanctuary, proving that government persecution campaigns could be exported to damage reputations and eliminate safe havens for targets of political harassment. The professional relationships that were damaged by international manhunt included entertainment industry figures and business associates in multiple countries who became reluctant to maintain connections with someone who was being actively pursued by government agencies across international boundaries.
The technological surveillance that enabled international manhunt included monitoring of communications and financial transactions across multiple jurisdictions, creating privacy violations that exceeded normal law enforcement authority and demonstrated how expanded government powers could be used for political persecution rather than legitimate criminal investigation. The treaty interpretation disputes that arose from international manhunt included disagreements about the scope of mutual assistance obligations and the legitimacy of using international cooperation agreements to pursue what appeared to be politically motivated harassment rather than genuine criminal investigation based on credible evidence. The sovereignty violations that international manhunt represented included attempts to enforce Australian legal interpretations in foreign jurisdictions that had different tax laws, business regulations, and constitutional protections, creating conflicts between national legal systems and international law principles. The refugee status implications of Paul's situation included the question of whether someone being persecuted by their own government for political reasons could seek asylum or protection in foreign countries, highlighting the international law complications that arose when democratic governments engaged in arbitrary harassment of their own citizens. The diplomatic embarrassment that international manhunt created for Australia included foreign government concerns about the proportionality and legitimacy of persecution campaigns that seemed designed to punish success rather than address genuine criminal behavior, damaging the country's reputation for respecting individual rights and due process. The precedent that international manhunt established for future government persecution included demonstration that domestic harassment could be exported across international boundaries, that diplomatic cooperation could be weaponized against individuals, and that successful citizens could become hunted fugitives from their own governments without adequate legal protection. The constitutional crisis that international manhunt represented included the question of whether democratic governments could use their power to destroy individuals who had achieved international recognition, whether constitutional protections had any meaning when agencies decided to target successful citizens, and whether international cooperation could be perverted to serve political persecution rather than legitimate law enforcement goals. Chapter 6. The Financial Destruction Campaign, the systematic obliteration of Paul Hogan's wealth through 8 years of legal warfare represented not tax collection but financial terrorism, as Australian government agencies used unlimited taxpayer resources to drain his Crocodile Dundee fortune through deliberate delay tactics, expanded investigations, and settlement extortion that proved the persecution was designed to punish success rather than collect legitimate taxes. The legal fee hemorrhaging that characterized Paul's financial destruction began immediately with the investigation announcement and accelerated exponentially as government agencies expanded the scope of their harassment to include multiple jurisdictions, complex business structure challenges, and international asset investigations that required specialized expertise, commanding premium rates for extended periods. Actor Paul Hogan has settled a marathon 8-year tax dispute with the Australian Taxation Office. The actor says the confidential settlement was reached on a without admission basis, but this resolution came only after Paul had been forced to liquidate assets, mortgage properties, and exhaust retirement savings to fund legal defense against allegations that were never proved in court. The deliberate delay tactics that government agencies employed throughout the investigation included repeated requests for additional documentation, expanded scope of inquiry whenever resolution seemed possible, and strategic scheduling of hearings and deadlines designed to maximize Paul's legal expenses while demonstrating agency control over investigation timelines. The asset freeze strategies that accompanied financial destruction included restrictions on normal banking and investment activities that prevented Paul from accessing his own money while simultaneously requiring him to pay mounting legal fees, creating impossible financial pressure that served agencies' goals of forcing settlement regardless of legal merits. The opportunity cost that financial destruction created included lost income from projects Paul couldn't pursue while under investigation, investment returns on assets that had to be liquidated for legal defense, and professional collaborations that became impossible due to government harassment and negative publicity campaigns. The international legal coordination that multiplied Paul's financial burden included requirements for specialized expertise in multiple jurisdictions, currency exchange complications, and the premium costs of legal representation that understood complex international business structures and tax law interactions. The forensic accounting expenses that government demands created included detailed analysis of decades of business transactions, expert witnesses to explain legitimate commercial practices, and specialized consultants to address allegations about international business structures that had been professionally recommended and properly implemented. The discovery process costs that agencies imposed included production of massive document collections, electronic data analysis, and translation services for international business records, creating additional expenses that served government interests in making continued resistance economically unsustainable. The settlement negotiation manipulation that characterized the financial destruction campaign included government agencies' strategic timing of demands to coincide with Paul's maximum financial stress, when legal fee accumulation had reached the point where settlement seemed preferable to continued resistance regardless of actual legal merits.
The precedent that Paul's financial destruction established for future government persecution included demonstration that individual wealth provided no protection against agency harassment, that legal defense costs could exceed any reasonable tax obligation, and that settlement could be extorted through systematic financial pressure rather than legitimate legal proceedings. The constitutional violations that financial destruction represented included denial of due process through economic warfare, punishment before conviction through asset freezing, and the use of unlimited government resources to destroy individual citizens who challenged agency authority or achieved success that made bureaucrats feel inadequate. The international implications of financial destruction included damage to Australia's reputation as safe destination for investment and business development, as foreign observers recognized that success could make individuals targets for government harassment that violated constitutional protections and democratic principles. The family impact of financial destruction included stress on relatives who watched Paul's lifetime achievements being systematically destroyed by government agencies that seemed motivated more by jealousy and political opportunism than legitimate law enforcement goals or constitutional responsibilities. The health consequences of financial stress included medical conditions that required treatment while Paul's resources were being consumed by legal defense, creating additional costs and complications that served government agencies' strategy of making continued resistance physically as well as economically unsustainable. The business relationship damage that financial destruction created included loss of professional partnerships and collaborative opportunities as associates became reluctant to work with someone whose financial stability was being systematically undermined by government harassment that could extend to anyone who maintained business connections. The ultimate irony of Paul's financial destruction was that it cost him far more than any legitimate tax obligation could have justified, proving that the persecution was never about tax collection but about demonstrating government power over individuals whose international success had challenged bureaucratic and political authority through authentic achievement and cultural contribution. Chapter 7: The Exile's Desperate Gambit. As the Australian government's persecution campaign reached its crescendo, Paul Hogan faced the ultimate choice between financial annihilation and permanent exile, forcing him to abandon the homeland he had served so faithfully in order to preserve what remained of his wealth, health, and dignity from agencies that had demonstrated their willingness to destroy him completely rather than admit their persecution was politically motivated. The settlement negotiations that preceded Paul's exile represented not justice but extortion, as government agencies offered to end their harassment in exchange for substantial payments that bore no relationship to legitimate tax obligations but served their political need to claim victory while avoiding the embarrassment of having their case collapse in court due to lack of evidence. The confidential settlement was reached on a without admission basis, but this language disguised the reality that Paul was forced to pay substantial sums to end harassment that had consumed his fortune while never establishing evidence of actual wrongdoing, proving that the agencies had successfully extorted payment through systematic financial warfare rather than legitimate legal proceedings. The decision to accept exile rather than continued resistance was based on Paul's recognition that Australian government agencies possessed unlimited resources and political protection that allowed them to continue harassment indefinitely, while his own resources were finite and being consumed at rates that made eventual bankruptcy inevitable regardless of legal merits. The physical and psychological exhaustion that drove Paul toward exile included 8 years of constant stress, financial pressure, and social isolation that had damaged his health and relationships in ways that made continued resistance seem impossible, even if he possessed unlimited resources for legal defense against agencies accountable only to political pressure. The international sanctuary that exile provided included residence in jurisdictions where Australian agencies possessed limited harassment capabilities and where constitutional protections might provide better safeguards against arbitrary government action, demonstrating that his own homeland had become the most dangerous place for him to live. The family relationship damage that forced exile included estrangement from Australian relatives who had become collateral victims of government persecution, creating additional personal costs that served agencies' strategy of making continued resistance emotionally as well as financially unsustainable through systematic destruction of support networks. The professional opportunities that exile eliminated included Australian projects and collaborations that might have provided income or creative satisfaction, but which became impossible due to departure prohibition and the ongoing threat of resumed harassment if he returned to the jurisdiction where agencies maintained their persecution capabilities. The cultural loss that exile represented included separation from the Australian identity and community connections that had defined Paul's life and career, forcing him to abandon the homeland whose reputation he had enhanced through decades of authentic cultural ambassadorship that had generated enormous economic and diplomatic benefits. The media portrayal of Paul's exile consistently characterized his departure as evidence of guilt rather than recognition of persecution, demonstrating how government agencies could manipulate public opinion to justify their harassment while portraying their target as criminal rather than victim of political prosecution. The precedent that forced exile established for other successful Australians included the lesson that international achievement could make you a target for government persecution, that constitutional protections provided no defense against agency harassment, and that homeland could become the most dangerous place for citizens who had achieved too much success. The diplomatic implications of forcing Paul into exile included international recognition that Australia had become a country where government agencies could arbitrarily persecute their own citizens, damaging the nation's reputation for respecting individual rights and constitutional protections that were supposed to characterize democratic societies. The economic impact of Paul's forced exile included loss of his continued cultural ambassadorship, reduced international confidence in Australian protection of successful individuals, and the message that extraordinary achievement would be punished rather than celebrated by government institutions supposed to serve rather than threaten productive citizens. The constitutional crisis that forced exile represented included the fundamental question of whether democratic governments could use their power to drive away citizens whose success challenged bureaucratic authority, whether individual achievement created vulnerability to government persecution, and whether constitutional protections had any meaning when agencies decided to target successful individuals. The international sympathy that Paul's forced exile generated included foreign recognition that he had become a victim of political persecution rather than legitimate law enforcement, creating diplomatic embarrassment for Australia while demonstrating the consequences of allowing government agencies to target successful citizens for political rather than legal reasons. The personal tragedy that exile represented included Paul's transformation from beloved cultural ambassador to political refugee, forced to live in foreign countries rather than the homeland he had served so faithfully, proving that extraordinary service to your country provides no protection against government agencies that view success as threat rather than achievement worth protecting. The ultimate victory that government agencies achieved through forced exile was not tax collection or law enforcement, but demonstration of their power to destroy anyone who achieved international recognition that made them feel inadequate, regardless of that person's contributions to national interests or cultural development.
Chapter 8. The Permanent Fugitive. In the final phase of his transformation from cultural icon to hunted exile, Paul Hogan's permanent departure from Australia represents the ultimate success of government persecution that achieved its true goal, punishing extraordinary success while teaching other Australians that achievement beyond bureaucratic comfort levels would result in systematic destruction disguised as law enforcement. The permanent residence that Paul established outside Australia represents not a personal choice, but the inevitable result of government harassment that made return to his homeland impossible without risking resumed persecution by agencies that had demonstrated their willingness to destroy him completely rather than admit their political motivations. He's always missed home, and he's always spent a lot more time here than people realize. He's back and forth all the time, but he doesn't call the press conference when he comes back to spend time with his family. I think eventually he will come back to Australia for sure. I think this is home. He's always been home for him, observers noted, but this hope ignores the reality that Australian agencies remain capable of resumed harassment if political circumstances make Paul useful as target again. The legal vulnerability that permanent exile addresses includes the ongoing threat that Australian government agencies could revive their persecution if domestic political pressure requires high-profile prosecutions or if Paul's presence in Australia becomes politically inconvenient for officials who benefited from his original harassment. The psychological impact of permanent exile includes the daily awareness that he cannot safely return to the homeland he served so faithfully, creating ongoing trauma that serves government agencies' goal of demonstrating the consequences of achieving international success that challenges bureaucratic authority and political control. The family relationships that permanent exile damages include ongoing separation from Australian relatives and cultural connections that provided meaning and identity throughout his life and career, creating permanent personal costs that extend the government's successful punishment beyond financial destruction. The cultural loss that permanent exile represents includes Paul's removal from Australian society and cultural development, eliminating his potential ongoing contributions to national identity and international relationships while serving agencies' goal of punishing success that had made them feel inadequate by comparison. The international embarrassment that Paul's permanent exile creates for Australia includes foreign recognition that the country has become unsafe for its own successful citizens, damaging diplomatic relationships and cultural reputation while demonstrating the consequences of allowing government persecution to succeed completely. The economic impact of permanent exile includes loss of Paul's continued tourism promotion, cultural ambassadorship,
and international relationship development that might have generated ongoing economic benefits for Australia if government agencies had not prioritized political persecution over national interests. The precedent that permanent exile establishes for other successful Australians includes the lesson that extraordinary achievement creates vulnerability to government persecution that can only be escaped through abandoning your homeland, teaching future generations that success should be hidden rather than celebrated. The constitutional failure that permanent exile represents includes the complete breakdown of protections that were supposed to shield citizens from arbitrary government harassment, proving that democratic principles mean nothing when agencies decide to target individuals whose achievements challenge their political authority. The media cooperation that enables permanent exile includes ongoing portrayals of Paul as tax cheat rather than persecution victim, demonstrating how press independence can be compromised to support government narratives that justify political harassment while avoiding accountability for constitutional violations. The diplomatic consequences that Paul's permanent exile creates include international questioning of Australia's commitment to individual rights and democratic principles, as foreign observers recognize the persecution patterns that force successful citizens to seek safety in other countries rather than trusting their homeland's institutions. The health impact that permanent exile imposes includes ongoing stress from being separated from homeland and cultural identity, creating medical consequences that serve government agencies' successful demonstration of the total life destruction that can result from achieving success that threatens bureaucratic comfort and political control. The business relationship damage that permanent exile perpetuates includes ongoing reluctance of international partners to invest in Australian opportunities that might make them vulnerable to similar government harassment, creating economic consequences that extend beyond Paul's individual situation to affect national economic development. The legacy destruction that permanent exile achieves includes transformation of Paul's reputation from cultural ambassador to controversial figure, demonstrating government agencies' success in rewriting history to justify their persecution while eliminating positive examples of authentic Australian achievement and international success. The ultimate triumph of government persecution through permanent exile is not tax collection or law enforcement, but successful intimidation of all other potentially successful Australians who have learned that extraordinary achievement will be punished through systematic destruction disguised as legitimate government authority exercised in service of political rather than legal goals. Epilogue: the most wanted legacy, as Paul Hogan lives out his remaining years in permanent exile from the homeland he served so faithfully. His transformation into Australia's most wanted man stands as the ultimate proof that in modern democracies, government agencies have learned to weaponize law enforcement powers against their own citizens when political convenience requires high-profile prosecutions to justify budgets, demonstrate effectiveness, or satisfy public anger about systemic problems they lack the competence or courage to address through legitimate means. The tax exile years that destroyed Paul's relationship with Australia represent not an isolated incident of government overreach, but a template for how democratic institutions can be perverted to serve political persecution while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement, teaching other successful citizens that extraordinary achievement makes them targets rather than assets worth protecting. I was never charged with tax evasion for lack of evidence, but I've still got that attached to me. Paul reflected about the permanent reputation damage that government harassment achieved even without successful prosecution, proving that agencies could accomplish their punishment goals through systematic destruction while avoiding the accountability that criminal conviction might require. The departure prohibition that trapped Paul in Australia during his mother's funeral will be remembered as one of the cruelest examples of government power being exercised not to serve justice, but to demonstrate bureaucratic authority over someone whose international success had made officials feel inadequate by comparison, revealing the petty jealousy that motivated sophisticated persecution campaigns. The 8-year financial hemorrhaging that consumed Paul's Crocodile Dundee fortune through legal fees and settlement extortion established precedents for how government agencies with unlimited taxpayer resources could drain individual wealth regardless of legal merits, proving that prosecution itself became punishment that exceeded any reasonable penalties for alleged violations. The media witch hunt that accompanied Paul's persecution demonstrated how press independence could be compromised to support government narratives about high-profile targets, creating trial by press conference that violated presumption of innocence while generating public support for harassment campaigns that served political rather than legal purposes. The international manhunt that extended Australian persecution across multiple jurisdictions proved that domestic government harassment could be exported to violate individual rights in foreign countries, creating diplomatic complications while demonstrating the lengths to which bureaucratic jealousy would go to destroy someone whose success challenged official authority. The forced settlement that ended Paul's active persecution represented successful extortion rather than legitimate tax collection, as government agencies offered to cease harassment in exchange for payments that bore no relationship to any credible evidence of wrongdoing, but served their political need to claim victory while avoiding judicial scrutiny. The permanent exile that Paul accepted as alternative to continued persecution proved that his own homeland had become the most dangerous place for him to live. Demonstrating complete success of government campaigns to punish extraordinary achievement, while teaching other potentially successful citizens that international recognition creates vulnerability rather than celebrating cultural contribution. The constitutional violations that characterized every phase of Paul's persecution, denial of due process, punishment before conviction, presumption of guilt, arbitrary detention, financial warfare, media manipulation, established precedents that destroyed democratic protections while proving that successful citizens possessed no safeguards against government agencies determined to demonstrate their political power. The cultural loss that Paul's exile represents includes elimination of his ongoing contributions to Australian identity and international relationships, demonstrating how government persecution could eliminate national assets in pursuit of political goals that served bureaucratic rather than public interests while damaging the country's cultural development and diplomatic relationships. The diplomatic embarrassment that Paul's treatment created for Australia continues to influence international perceptions of the country's commitment to individual rights and democratic principles, as foreign observers recognize persecution patterns that characterize authoritarian rather than democratic governance of successful citizens who challenge political authority through authentic achievement. The economic impact of Paul's destruction extends beyond his individual case to include international reluctance to invest in Australian opportunities that might create vulnerability to similar government harassment, creating ongoing costs that exceed any possible tax revenue while demonstrating the self-destructive nature of political persecution disguised as law enforcement. The educational value that Paul's persecution provides for other successful Australians includes the lesson that extraordinary achievement will be punished rather than celebrated, that constitutional protections mean nothing when agencies decide to target individuals for political reasons, and that homeland can become enemy territory for citizens whose success threatens bureaucratic comfort and political control. The historical significance of Paul's transformation into Australia's most wanted man lies not in any individual injustice but in its demonstration that democratic institutions can be weaponized to destroy their own most successful citizens when political convenience requires high-profile prosecutions, teaching future generations that government agencies serve political rather than public interest when constitutional principles conflict with bureaucratic authority. The ultimate legacy of Paul's tax exile years is the proof that in modern Australia, being wanted by your government is evidence not of criminal behavior, but of success that threatens political authority, achievement that challenges bureaucratic comfort, or cultural contribution that makes officials feel inadequate, demonstrating that the most wanted list has become a roster of the nation's most successful citizens rather than its most dangerous criminals. As Paul Hogan concludes his extraordinary life in permanent exile from the country he represented so faithfully, his status as Australia's most wanted man serves as eternal reminder that democratic governments can become more dangerous to their own successful citizens than any foreign enemy, and that constitutional protections mean nothing when agencies decide that extraordinary achievement must be punished rather than celebrated by institutions supposed to serve rather than threaten the productive citizens who create the wealth and culture that sustain civilized society.